Hello, welcome to Cult Hackers, a podcast that explores cultic thinking. My name is Stephen and I'm a former member of a fundamentalist cultic group, now trained as an organisational psychologist, and I work as a leadership trainer and coach. So before I start with today's topic, I just want to say it's a really hot day today here in the UK. So I've got the window open, so you might hear some kind of garden noises, some pigeons and birds. I apologise if that distracts you, but I'd melt otherwise. It's just too hot. We don't have aircon in this country. Not much anyway. Right, I also wanted to acknowledge some big political stuff that's been happening over the last couple of weeks. We've had an assassination attempt on former President Trump and Joe Biden stepping down from the election race. And here in the UK, we've had a week of riots. Now, I'm going to talk about that shortly. That's going to be the main topic. But firstly, the assassination attempt on Donald Trump was shocking. You know, I'm a believer in argument and discussion as a way to progress, not violence. Clearly, killing somebody in the name of, well, anything, to me is wrong, pointless, and yeah, we can do nothing but condemn that. Unfortunately, the shooter was killed, so we don't currently really understand his motivations. It all gets politicised, of course, but we don't really understand that yet, I don't think. But I also want to say how awful it was that a bystander who was standing behind Trump was shot and killed. So I think we have to condemn that as well. The other major news, as I said, is the stepping down of Joe Biden. You know, I'm sure our podcast about how quitting can be good and the reasons we put forward why he should step down from the candidacy was a major contributory factor, I'm sure. Anyway, I think it's confirmed now that Kamala Harris is going to be the Democratic candidate. The Democrats seem to have had a bit of a boost. As I've said on the previous podcast, as someone who doesn't get a vote in the US election and a citizen of a different country, I'm always hesitant to weigh in my opinion on other people's elections. But of course, America is such an important country to the UK and the rest of the world that it's hard not to be interested and indeed anxious. And I do genuinely believe Trump and the people that he surrounded himself with to be truly dangerous. And I take this view not because of what his opponents say about him, but what he and they say themselves. But as I said before, I would never condone violence towards him. So the main news in the UK are the riots fueled by the far-right extremists. So I'm very conscious that this podcast goes out to lots of different countries, but by far the most listeners come from the US. So I'm conscious you may not be aware of the riots that have been happening, but you may have heard some news about them. I believe Elon Musk has said that civil war is inevitable in the UK. Obviously a real expert in the UK, so thank you, Mr. Musk. But yeah, we have been having some riots. These people are rioting in the streets. These are men who are complaining about broken Britain by coming out into the streets, throwing bricks at the police and setting fire to vehicles. It's like a child complaining about the state of their bedroom after they've made a mess in it. It's kind of odd though, because in the last episode I was responding to what seems to be a growing movement of people claiming that multiculturalism is a failed experiment, or that somehow their culture is under attack and needs defending. This has been kind of in the ether for some time, and that's why I did an episode about it. Often this opinion is wrapped around a fear of Islam and fueled by a variety of conspiracy theories. It's an international movement, one with its propagators residing in most of the advanced economies around the world. And of course they communicate through Twitter or X or other types of social media. Of course it is all wrapped up with immigration, and I've watched the language change over the years as populist politicians use the issue to generate fear and provide what they claim is the solution. So that's kind of the populist playbook: scare everybody and then tell them that they have the plan. But more mainstream politicians, afraid of their right flank, have also started to adopt some of this language themselves. And I've noticed this, I'm sure you've noticed it too. So in the last episode, I really wanted to put the case for multiculturalism, or at least for a society that embraces difference and that can recognise the benefits of migration. I recognise that some culture clashes are inevitable, but that they're relatively few, and that in the main people rub up against each other pretty well. Also that there is a sharing of cultural practices that creates something new and we can celebrate. So, if you didn't hear that episode, then I won't repeat it here. But yes, this week in the UK we've had a series of riots in many of the cities and towns of the UK, in particular England, but also involving Northern Ireland too. If you're not a UK resident, you may not have been aware of the background, so I'll briefly explain this and give my thoughts about what is happening. So about a week ago, we started to hear the terrible news about a knife attack on a group of little girls taking part in a Taylor Swift themed dance yoga class. A 17-year-old young man took a taxi to the building, ran into it and attacked the children and the teacher who was running the class, along with a businessman who had heard the screams and came in to try and help. So he was also stabbed. 15 people, I think, received stab wounds, and unfortunately 3 little girls aged 5 and 6 died. It's hard to express the horror of that. It's absolutely heartbreaking. So it's one of those things that you can't stop thinking about. In the UK, it's illegal for news outlets to release the name of a minor who's been charged with a crime. So the major outlets like the BBC, Sky News, ITV and so on, and the newspapers couldn't release the name of the person or reveal in any way his identity. So in this vacuum, an online outlet claiming to be a news outlet gave the man a name, which was obviously Islamic, and claimed that this man was an illegal immigrant who'd come over on a small boat. I mentioned that last time about people travelling across the channel on small boats. So this was the claim, that this man had come across on a small boat and carried out this attack. We also had a number of people claiming that the mainstream media were not telling the truth about the person and hiding information. Nigel Farage, an MP from the Reform Party, made a statement where he questioned whether the truth is being withheld from us. So all of this stoked up a lot of anger and fear. Now, as I've said, the law is very clear in the UK. You cannot release the identity of a minor who's been charged. We then had figures such as Andrew Tate making a video repeating the same information about the attacker as that so-called outlet had, and others too. So it became one of these causes that is taken up by these so-called influencers. So this is the backdrop to the riots. The first of the riots was in the town where the girls died. It's hard for me to understand the heartlessness of rioters trashing the very community trying to come to terms with its grief and mourn their children. The morning after, though, members of the local community turned out to clean up. A builder, for free, rebuilt the wall that had been dismantled as a source of ammunition that they'd been throwing at the police, and local residents gave flowers to the representative of the mosque to show solidarity. And that contrast between the behaviour of those local residents and these thugs, I think, is very interesting and very telling. So over the last few evenings we've had other cities hit by riots, with coordination being carried out by extreme right-wing groups. In the meantime, the judge in charge of the case against the alleged attacker has lifted the ban on naming him, partly because of the risk to public order, but also the fact that he's going to turn 18 shortly, so he would be named then anyway. So we now know that he was born in Wales to Rwandan parents. There is nothing to suggest that he has anything to do with Islam, and that's all we know so far. We don't know anything else. So any other speculation is just that, it's just speculation. We'll get to know more, of course. He will be tried, and the reporting on the case will hopefully tell us more about the motives behind the attack. It's hard to even comprehend what they might have been. But whatever the circumstances or the motives, this cannot justify the behaviour of the rioters. Even if the attacker had been doing it in the name of an extremist group or religion, it still can't justify a gang of men marching to attack a mosque any more than a racist attack by a white supremacist on a group of worshippers can be an excuse to attack a random church. In addition to the right-wing exploiters, we then have some more mainstream commentators who, while not condoning the actions of the rioters, see it as a symptom of something deeper and to some degree seem to have some sympathy with their frustrations. And they diagnose the problem as politicians for decades not being honest with people about migration and not listening to voices expressing concerns about numbers. One newspaper columnist I was listening to on a podcast said that the metropolitan elite are just not listening to the concerns of ordinary people and that this is just the tip of an iceberg. Obviously, I'm not an expert in this area and I'm not so arrogant as to think I can provide the answers to an issue that seems to be affecting not just my own country but across the world. But here are some questions that I think we should be asking, and I'm going to think out loud about them right now. So firstly, my first question is, who are the people who are rioting? And I don't think we really know this yet, but people are making assumptions about who they are. But we should be able to find this out as they start to be identified and charged with disorder offences. You know, all the police wear cameras, there's lots of cameras around. These people will be identified. A lot of them were not wearing any masks or headgear, so it's easy to see who they were. But who are they? It's likely that they're going to be a mixture of people, of course, but I predict, and this is only a prediction, but I predict that a lot of them, maybe around half of them, are going to be your basic thug. The person, normally a guy, who enjoys going out of an evening and fighting with the police. We have some clues that these people are part of this group in some of the photographs of young men bringing their cans of beer with them to have a riot. It's been warm weather this week in the UK, so for these lads it's part of a mad summer of fun, you know. We've always had this contingent in this country. I'm old enough to remember the bad old days of football hooliganism, where for some a Saturday afternoon just wasn't complete without a good fight. And this mentality hasn't disappeared, it's just not at football grounds so much because the police and the clubs got too good at spotting them, banning them, and the police charging them. But it will be interesting to see how many of these rioters are turning up at different cities. And it seems to be that a single city each evening is targeted, so it's likely that there are hardcore of a few hundred men travelling the country trying to make trouble in a different place every night. Anyway, we need to know who they are to determine whether this is somehow the result of actual concerns, like some of the commentators are claiming, or if it is just thugs being thugs. So the next question would be, if there are people in those riots who are not thugs just being thugs but feel angry or frustrated about something, the question is, what exactly is it that they are so worried about? And so far I've listened to these commentators and I'm really not clear about exactly what they think the concerns are. And that obviously doesn't mean there are no concerns, but it has to be clear what these issues they have are so they can be addressed. So let's be charitable and try to think about what these concerns might be about immigration, because that's really what these riots are all about. So I'm going to go through and think about some of the issues that these commentators might be referring to. Sometimes they've offered some of the issues, and so I'm going to talk about what those might be and what we could do about them. So strain on public services is one concern that is sometimes floated by these columnists and commentators. So if this is the concern, then of course there's a legitimacy about that. Doctor services, schools, housing, etc. all have limits to the numbers they can deal with, and when large numbers of people move into an area, increasing its population, services need to be increased too to cope with the demand. But are we really seeing that as a problem? Are communities actually growing in numbers of people where immigration is high? Well, it's possible, but we would have to question it because we've not been building enough new houses for decades, so where are these people living? Now, there are some cases of unscrupulous gangmasters providing a single room with multiple occupants for migrant workers to live in, but these are cases of modern day slavery, and while this does happen and it's a serious problem, it's hard to believe that this alone would increase the population significantly. The numbers just are not there. I don't know if this is a theoretical risk or is really happening. Either way, the answer to this is a more strategic and joined up approach to town planning and management of migration. Finally, on this point, it's also worth noting that much of the migration in the UK relates to healthcare workers. Go into any hospital or social care setting and it's obvious that these services depend on immigration. Other sectors with lots of migrant workers are the hospitality and food sectors, from picking fruit to working in our food factories. Most migrants to the UK are legal and have jobs, pay taxes and so on. A comparatively small number of migrants come over on these small boats, and most of those are detained and are not allowed to work. That's not to belittle the problem, it's still too many people making such a terrible risk. In 2023, around 29,000 people came across on these small boats, according to the Migration Observatory website. It's also a pressure on the immigration service, which obviously then has to process their claim to stay, give them permission or send them back to their country of origin. But to put this number in context, in the same year, estimates on immigration, on legal immigration, was around 1.2 million, with emigration, that people going the other way, at 532,000, meaning that net migration is somewhere around 700,000 people mark. That's in 2023, and this was an unusually high number. Overall, it's expected that these will fall, but if we compare 29,000 people coming on small boats to 1.2 million, it's clear that the small boats is a safety problem for the people on the boats, and it's a processing problem. We need to be able to process that many people. But in terms of the questions around migration, it's just not the issue. So why else could people be concerned and angry? Well, a classic one that I hear Donald Trump saying a lot is that migrants are taking our jobs, or taking your jobs. I can't really speak about the US, but in the UK there is actually a chronic labour shortage, and this was inevitable in my view, and I, like many others, predicted it. As a professional working in the food industry, it was obvious that if we made it more difficult to recruit workers from the EU, we would struggle to have enough people to work on our fields and in our factories. So what's happened is that we've massively reduced migration from the EU and hugely increased it from countries outside of the EU, but we still have large numbers of migration. So people that thought that Brexit was going to stop that were of course wrong, and that was always going to be the case because our industries depend upon it. Now that may not be sustainable, that might not be the right way to do things, but that is the way that our economy currently works, and there was no plan to change that. But despite 1.2 million people coming in last year and a net migration of 700,000, we're still short of labour, we're still short of workers. Every business I go to talks about the same problem. They don't have enough people to work in their factories or to work in their restaurants, or pretty much every industry has the same problem. Now there are always going to be exceptions, but in the main, migrants are not taking the jobs the locals are desperate to have. Instead, they're mainly what are called low-skilled jobs on minimum wage, or there's a few higher, very highly skilled jobs such as doctors, where we simply don't do a good enough job of training UK-born nationals. So taking our jobs? No, that's not happening currently. Maybe it has happened in the past, but it's not happening now. So what else could be the source of frustration and anger? One of the things we hear on radio phone-ins and vox pops is that some people feel like a foreigner in their own country and that they want their country back. So let's just unpick this for a moment. One of the complaints of Nigel Farage MP is that he can be travelling in London and not hear English spoken at all. Now, I can't testify to the truthfulness of this experience, of course, but not hearing English spoken is one of the complaints that we hear. I struggle to care much about this complaint, I have to say. It seems that the degree of privilege it speaks to is hard to put into words. You know, I count myself extremely lucky to have been born in a country that speaks the world's second language. It's kind of English is the lingua franca of the modern world. So it means I can go to most countries around the world and make myself understood and understand them. How lucky for me! To then complain when two people are talking in their first language to each other on a bus or on the tube in the UK is pathetic. Most people who migrate to the UK speak English already, and those that can't learn it quickly. We're famously bad in the UK at learning second languages, so for them to get by, they have to do that. So yeah, let people speak their mother tongue when they're talking to each other. But of course, we expect people to learn English when they go to work or when they go to school and so on. Still on the question of feeling like a foreigner in their own country, what about those cultural things we spoke about last time? So I'm not going to repeat it all. Suffice to say that it's not surprising that individuals might experience some discomfort at times when presented with different cultural practices. We talked about Henri Tajfel's in-groups and out-groups and the tendency for human beings to categorise and favour what they consider to be the in-group. This is a well-documented bit of human behaviour, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't challenge it. Just because we feel uncomfortable doesn't mean that the world has to change for us. The fact that even though there is no evidence that the terrible attack had any religious motivation, that the rioters targeted a mosque is significant. There's something that concerns me about this specific aspect, and it's a set of thoughts that have been rattling around my head for some time, not quite knowing what to think about it. So I'm going to try to explain my thinking on this. It might be a bit clumsy because I'm still kind of working it out, but most mass movements have two parts to them. There's the foot soldiers, who are the kind of minions who do what they're told or do what they're influenced to do. And then they're the leaders. So these leaders are either the generals or the intellectual thought leaders. Often these thought leaders are not necessarily strategic about what they're saying or thinking about, but they sit in their ivory towers thinking big thoughts and devising the theoretical basis for their ideas. So, to take an example, if we go back to Nazi Germany, for instance, there were the thuggish enforcers of the SS. But the Nazi ideology was a form of political extremism underpinned by all sorts of pseudo-scientific ideas around racial purity and so on. The thugs setting fire to synagogues or killing people in camps may not have understood the finer points of the ideology, but that's not to say that the ideology was not important. It was needed to justify horrific acts of violence. So we kind of have this intellectual side of things, and we then have the behaviour that the common people act out. Now, in the case that I've just mentioned, it seems that the so-called intellectuals and the party thugs were all part of the same movement, but that's not necessary. So the intellectuals and the thought leaders don't necessarily have to be exactly the same group as the people that use these ideologies and ideas as justification for their own behaviour. So fear and suspicion of Islam is much more mainstream than it used to be, or at least it feels like it to me. The attack on 9/11 in 2001 changed many things. The so-called war on terror was one, but it also gave rise to a new, robust form of atheism that challenge the idea that we should respect religion. Now, for me as a non-believer and a humanist, there's much to admire about the scepticism that this robust atheism brought. And being able to challenge beliefs and take on religious ideology was something that was exciting to me as I left my fundamentalism, and in many ways still is. And as I said last week, there are some behaviours that cannot be accepted in modern liberal democracies, regardless of their cultural nature or heritage. The bad behaviour of cultic religions being an example, slavery being another. But unfortunately, broad attacks on Islam and Muslims by public intellectuals is often picked up by the thugs and used as an excuse for the sorts of behaviour that we've been seeing over the last week. And if you listen to the far right talking about why they're doing what they're doing, they often use the exact same talking points as the better educated anti-Islamic commentators. It's obvious to anyone being serious that the thugs marching upon a mosque last week didn't really care about women's rights in Saudi Arabia, but it gives them an excuse and they use it. Don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that we shouldn't call out bad behaviour, but I think care is needed to be clear about the specifics and not paint a whole religion with the same brush, which is often what happens. This week, all of the newspapers are rightly describing the behaviour of the rioters as appalling. But many of them have played their part in whipping up anger about migration and focusing on the problem of small boats. Migrants, as so often in history, are very useful scapegoats to blame for wider societal problems. Inequality in the UK has grown hugely, as it has for many countries, and has left some communities much poorer with little to feel they have a stake in. For the rich and powerful, including the owners of many of these newspapers and media outlets, both old and new media, they don't want people to notice that this is really about their greed. And so blaming migrants provides convenient cover. And that's what they've done. And unfortunately, this brings me to the final reason that I can think that people feel frustrated about migration. It's sad to say it, but some people are simply racist. They don't want to be called it, but when it comes down to it, they want to live in a mythical past when the country was just right for them. And this doesn't include people who don't look or sound like them. Now, I agree that politicians should be more honest about migration and a lot of other things, but it's also about us. It's about the people being grown up enough to have a proper conversation about it. A grown-up conversation about migration would involve the topics of the benefits of migration, how migration helps an economy grow, and also how migration is a two-way street. Lots of UK people migrate to places around the world. One of the hilarious phenomena of Brexit was hearing expat Brits, another way of saying migrants, to Spain explain why they were voting Brexit, and then being surprised that it's made their lives more difficult for them to live on the Costa del Sol. Another part of the grown-up conversation would be, of course, about how we ensure that the services can grow as a population grows, if that's what's happening. How to maintain a sense of community cohesion when different parts of it have different cultural practices. We'd also be adult enough to consider how we as a rich country can meet our obligations to be a place for genuine asylum seekers to find sanctuary, just as we would hope other countries would do for us if we needed to. We would also talk about possible problems of migration for the countries that are losing part of their population. So it would be great to be able to have such a conversation, but I don't hold my breath currently, and part of that is because of the way that social media in particular has divided us up into tribes. I'm going to talk about tribes probably next time, and I want to discuss kind of where this idea comes from and also some of the psychology behind it. But for now, I'm going to leave the topic there. Okay, so finally, before I go, last week I said I wanted to start reading out some of your comments. You can find our contact page on the website culthackers.com/contact, and we'd really like to hear from you, and don't forget to indicate if you're okay with us reading out all or some of your message or identifying you by name. So today I'm going to feature a message by Darren. Darren has agreed to let me use his email. He says, "Hi, love your shows." So that's always a great start. Thank you, Darren. So he's responding here to the last episode that we did about culture. He says, when they say this is a Christian country and you replied with only 30% are Christian, they might say that their intentions are that England is based on Christian values and ways of being rather than purely stats regarding Christian churchgoers. Okay, so thanks again, Darren, for engaging with the question. Yeah, I guess some people who say this might have that view. And so what I say next in reply to you is in no way a criticism of your point. You rightly make the point that being aware of this can help me with my argument. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay, this is the editor version of me here. I want to do a quick correction at this point in relation to the percentage of people in the UK who identify as Christian. The actual number who identified as Christian in the last UK survey was 27.5 million people, which I think I stated correctly, but according to the Office for National Statistics, this makes the percentage actually 46.2%, a drop from the previous survey of 59.3%, but not 30%, as I stated. This was my mistake and was a bit of mental arithmetic that I really should have checked, so my apologies for that. I will always try to correct if I know that I've got something wrong. I still believe the point is valid though. To claim that we're a Christian country when less than half of the population identify as such is questionable at best. That said, back to podcast me. I suppose part of what I wanted to do in that episode was to challenge claims like this is a Christian country on its own merit. And it's something that I always try to do when I'm discussing an area of disagreement. So the "this is a Christian country" statement is quite stark and is normally said as a sort of thought-stopping cliche. You know, something incidentally cults do as a way to close down the conversation. You know, you've just sort of said the killer phrase and there is no more discussion after that. One of the ways I try to break through after someone uses a thought-stopping cliche is to take it on its own merit if I can. So like assume that that's the question they want answering or that's their opinion, so I'm going to address it. So I say, okay, what does that mean then? Let's discuss it, let's test the assertion. And the first question I think we'd have to ask is, you know, if we're going to say this is a Christian country, how many people are actually Christian? So when we look at the data, I think this has to be an effective challenge to the statement that we are a Christian country. I agree that we have a Christian heritage in many ways. We have lots of churches and cathedrals. We have a head of state who is also the head of the Church of England, King Charles. We even have bishops in the second legislative chamber, the House of Lords, something that I'm keen to support the removal of. We also have many traditions that are at least partly Christian, but many of them also speak of other cultural heritages as well. Christmas is a good example of this. You know, while it's supposed to be about the birth of Jesus, a lot of the traditions are obviously not Christian. Evergreen Christmas trees and plants like holly and mistletoe are obviously vestiges of older religious beliefs. And what have Easter eggs and bunnies got to do with the death of Jesus? Many of our traditions around marriage are clearly nothing to do with Christianity. Rings and wedding vows and so on. So we also have an older heritage. We could call it a pagan heritage too. Does that make us a pagan country? So, you know, I think, of course, the argument is fine and we could have a to and fro about it. But I really think it's about arguing with the data and the facts. And this is an approach I try to take for everything, including when it comes to cultic belief systems. Now, I understand not everyone agrees that this is the best way to debate tightly held beliefs, for instance, when debating religious beliefs. I've heard the argument that you can't logic it out with facts because it's not logic and facts that have led them to believe this. Now, I'm no debating expert, but for me, and from my experience, I feel that if we can't discuss facts and come to a decision based on evidence, then we're kind of all doomed. It's the only way I know how to do it. Okay, so that's pretty much covered everything I wanted to talk about today. Thank you very much for listening to Cult Hackers. Don't forget to reach out, send us your thoughts via email, and please put on whether you're okay for me to read the email out, or some of the email out, and indeed to use your name. Thanks again for listening. Speak to you soon. Bye for now.